Blogs on Gender Identity, Part 1. Kyler and Harper.
All right, thank you, Q. This is Kyler Broadus, and I am an attorney and founder of Trans People of Color Coalition and also the executive director, and I will be starting off, and Harper and I will be handing off. Harper, do you want to just go ahead and introduce yourself now?
Yes, I'm Harper Jean Tobin, and I'm the Policy Director at the National Center for Transgender Equality in Washington, D.C.
All right. We'll go to slide 6. And this is what we're going to do is what are the issues, what are the metrics, and the basis for advocacy. And we're going to talk about that because Harper and I are advocates for this. I've been around for a little while longer, but she's been around for quite a while doing advocacy as well. And we're going to share in a report, Injustice at Every Turn, a report, the National Transgender Discrimination Survey, which Harper works for the National Center for Trans Equality, and the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force were instrumental in orchestrating and putting out. So we'll go ahead and begin. We're going to begin with slide 7 and do a vocabulary check. And I see you guys have gotten, I've just kind of gone past my introduction because I know we have a limited amount of time, but I see that Q has put that out for you in my bio there, so for you. So we'll go to slide 7 now. And we're kind of going to do a vocabulary check, even though I believe it was Brad who came on, and he has some background in this area, and I'm sure other folks do too. But we're going to do I'm going to do a verbal poll, if you will. So while Q is unmuting us all, we're going to do a vocabulary check just to make sure everybody's on the same page. Because some of us do this work so much that we sort of forget that everybody may not be on the same page. So, A, and anybody can respond to this, an individual, you're going to answer what you think this is. And so an individual whose gender identity is different from sex, the individual was assigned at birth, what would you label that person? And why don't we start with, well, if I can go ahead and call on somebody if that's probably easier. Brad. Well, it's probably a no-brainer.
I would say transgender.
Okay. Does anybody see anything different? Okay. All right. B, a person's emotional and sexual attraction to other people based on the gender of the other person. Brian, what would that be if you could give it a title?
A person's emotional and sexual attraction to other people based on the gender of the other person. I don't know. I guess I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. I don't have a title.
Okay. And I know this is kind of hard because titles are putting people in boxes, but we do want to start on some common ground. Anybody else want to jump in and maybe help them?
Are you referring to sexual orientation?
Yes. Okay. Generally, that's what we refer to as sexual orientation. And obviously, Brad was...
Well, it can be everyone, no? Because both if you are heterosexual or homosexual, you always base your sexual attraction on the gender of the other person.
Yes, so, Roberto. Exactly. So thank you. You're right on. So, C, a person's internal, deeply felt sense of being male, female, something other, or in between. What would you call that?
Gender identification.
Exactly. You guys are doing great. If you were in person, I'd give you candy, but we probably don't need it anyway, right? Then we go whip to these last 3 real quickly. The process in which a transgender individual begins living their daily life in accordance with their gender identity.
Transition.
Oh, say again, Roberto. I'm sorry.
Transition?
Roberto said transition. Okay, and yeah, I would say that'd be correct. So, and finally, the last two: a person who identifies as male but was identified at birth as female.
Transgender?
Yeah, a transgender, but what type of transgender?
Sorry.
No, go ahead, Brianna. You haven't answered
All right.
anything.
I was just going to say, I guess it would depend. It could be a trans man or female to male.
Or
transgender
okay,
individual.
female to male. Is that the same as okay? How about as male to female? Actually, you've answered F, as in female to male,
Okay.
which is okay.
Oh, sorry.
And then, that's all right. And then E would be male to female, correct? Okay, so we shorten those. And again, we're generalizing. Q just pointed out there are many people that fall between these, beyond these. I lived 30 years in the non-gender binary, and came for me to be transsexual, so I am a male to female transsexual. All right? So that seems helpful. So we're gonna move on. Does anybody have any questions or comments on those slides? Or that slide? All right. Well, we'll move on then.
I'm going to go ahead just really quickly before you do that. I'm going to let everybody know I'm going to mute your lines again, and I'll unmute them individually if we need to do that again.
Thank you, Q.
Sure. So go ahead.
And then we're going to move on then to, because you're a great group and most of you got it, but we're going to go to slide 8. Who are trans people, gender identity, and one of you said it, and I don't recall the name, but is a person's internal, deeply felt psychological identification as male or female, or as we said, some people don't necessarily fall within either of those categories or may feel that they're in between those or a mix of those categories. So we need to be aware that it's not just the main gender binary. And then also we need to be aware that I think people forget when I do these talks all the time that everyone has a gender identity, which I always think is the intersection between L, G, B, and T, is because everybody has a gender identity and most people mischaracterize or assume someone's sexual orientation based on their gender identity sometimes, whether that's accurate or not. Also, as I said, gender identity doesn't have to correspond to the person's physical body. It's the internal sense of one's self. I navigated the world for years in a body that for me didn't work, but that's not everybody's journey. Some people it's not the right fit mentally or emotionally, and they may feel a mix of identities. And that's normal. Having a gender identity doesn't match your body may result in increasing psychological and emotional discomfort. And personally, I can say for me it certainly did, and I'm a much better person that they are congruent for me. Anybody? I'll keep going, and I always ask that just because I'm a teacher. Anybody have questions? So, moving on to slide 9. Being transgender does not affect a person's psychological health, stability, or competence as an employee. And personally for me, unfortunately for me, also I experienced that in the employment arena, that as soon as I announced my transition, all of a sudden it seemed as if everybody thought I was unstable, healthy mentally, and then I was no longer competent. And I don't know how 24 hours could change that, but it certainly did. Transgender persons should be treated in accordance with their gender identity when they begin to live as their true gender. Anybody have any questions?
If you guys have any questions, feel free to chat those out into the chat box or use the raise your hand button. But right now I don't see any questions in the chat box, Kyla, so you can chug along.
All right, super. Moving along to slide 10, diversity of trans people. The diversity is wide-reaching. Sometimes, and particularly as a person of color, and when I was coming out, all we saw were people that were Euro-identified or white, as the poll shows. And this is what we can have surveyed, but this is still, and the survey is great, mind you, but a small minutia of the people that are out there that we could find, because honestly, most people of color do not necessarily feel or call themselves trans or identify with the greater trans movement, but at the same time, obviously corresponding to the populations in the U.S., this is not a bad diagram of showing the percentage of different ethnicities and just the realization that there's a range of folks and they're not just white folk. So I'm going to hand over to my great partner, Harper, who's going to, so we change it up and keep it interesting for you, talk about how many trans folks are in the United States.
Thanks, Kyler. So keeping on with our theme of sort of general, of providing some background for working on these issues in the workplace setting, one of the most frequent questions that Kyler and I probably get asked is how many people are trans. And while we don't have the quality and the depth of population-based data about transgender people that we would like, we do have some data from state and federal surveys. The map you're currently seeing is the respondent distribution from the National Trans Discrimination Survey. It shows that folks responded to our survey from all over the country. It's a distribution that is pretty similar to the U.S. population distribution. In state and federal surveys that have been done to try to assess how many people are trans, the Williams Institute at UCLA analyzing that data has come up with an estimate of that it is somewhere between 700,000 and 1 million adults in the United States, this is not counting youth under 18, identify as transgender. So again, that estimate will probably be refined as we get better data, and with the caveat that Kyler mentioned that not everybody necessarily self-identifies with the same terminology such that they would answer a survey question. But we're talking about a sizable minority population within the U.S. That lives in every state and almost every, if not every, county in the U.S.
Harper, before you go on, I think there's a question related to what you were just covering, and Robert typed it in. I don't know if you can see it or not, but I'll be glad to read it quickly. He's going to read it. I'll read during quick Q&A, he says. Okay.
No, that was me that said that. This is Q,
okay.
And I was going to read that. So the question that Roberto posed was, he said, I have a non-politically correct question. I don't know if it's appropriate to share with the rest of the class. I would like to know if you know any transsexual person who defines him, herself as queer, and how she or he relates, situates trans identity with queer identity.
I'd be happy to take a stab at that. You know, in the trans discrimination survey, we asked about some demographic issues, including sexual orientation. In our survey, which again is not maybe 100% representative, we found there's a variety of sexual orientations that trans folks reported, and a lot of them identified specifically with the term queer. A large number identified as heterosexual, a large number identified as gay or lesbian or same-gender loving. But I think there's another question here, which is in the use of queer as it's sometimes used as a sort of umbrella term or a political identity for a broader community, and whether trans folks identify with that. And I think you'll find that varies. I think some people think of queer as identifying people who are non-heterosexual, and other times it's used to define a sort of more of a community identity of folks who are LGBTQ. I was just in France and was discussing it with European activists, and a lot of them tend to, including the trans activists, use queer more in that sense, whereas here in the U.S., often, particularly heterosexual identified trans folk, often I don't identify with the term queer. For organizing purposes, often we activists talk about like queer and trans people in the same way that we would say LGBT people. So I think the extent to which people trans folks identify with that terminology depends, particularly if they identify as heterosexual.
Thanks, Harper.
Sure. I want to go ahead and address the other question from Roberto, if I may.
Sure, of course.
Which is, would it be possible that the assumption of binarism is part of what pushes certain trans folks towards a transsexual transition? And I guess the implication of that being that, not everybody who, as Kyler was saying, who is transgender in the broader sense, necessarily transitions from male to female or from female to male. And I'll also caveat that sometimes the term transition is used even for folks who have a non-male-female binary identity to reflect the process of living their life more authentically with the gender identity that they do have. And I think certainly in the past, there was a much more rigid concept, I think, within the trans community and within the broader society of what it meant to be trans or gender variant, and what people's options were as far as how they could articulate their identity, how they could inhabit society. And I think that sense of limited options still impacts a lot of people's conception of sort of how they can be in the world. And I think we're seeing something of a generational shift in terms of, more people, finding the language and the space socially to to articulate non-binary identities, to have transitions that maybe don't look what we might expect in terms of male to female or female to male transitions, or to not transition and express their gender identities in other ways. I mean, as Kyler said, it's a very diverse community in terms of race and ethnicity, but also in terms of gender identity and expression. There's probably a lot more that could be said about that, but for purposes of time, perhaps we could forge ahead and return to these themes if folks want to in the Q&A at the end.
Thanks, Harper.
Caveat, I'll also say that the population estimate that I was talking about was not specifically for transsexual or transitioning folks, but for folks who identify themselves as transgender generally. So that's that broader population. In the U.S. and elsewhere, we've seen significant social progress, but also continuing social stigma affecting the trans community. And what I have here is a screenshot to sort of represent that sort of tension. It's from an article from the Fox News website about developments from the California and Oregon state insurance commissioners, who both within a period of weeks issued regulations or bulletins addressing the discrimination by insurance carriers against transgender people. But in their very story reporting on this really groundbreaking developments in state civil rights policies, this major news outlet used this picture from it feels like it came out when I was about 3 years old, a comedy with Robin Williams, who plays somebody who cross-dresses by circumstance, obviously making light of the whole topic of transgender people and not anything to do with the story. So this seemed to me to represent, to capture this continuing tension of the great strides that trans people are making in U.S. society and elsewhere, and yet the continuing sort of stigma and the lack of seriousness with trans identities and trans lives are often still taken. Mm-hmm. In the NCDS, we found a wide range of health and economic and social disparities affecting trans people. We found that even though the respondents to our survey reported higher than average educational attainment, they were nevertheless twice as likely to be unemployed as the general population at the time. They were 4 times as likely to live on extremely low incomes. A large majority said that at least some of their personal identification documents did not reflect their gender identity. And almost 1 in 5 trans people said they had been homeless at some point. Almost 1 in 5 said they had been refused medical care at some point, specifically because they were transgender. And here we're talking about just refusal of care by a service provider because of bias. We'll get into issues with insurance later, but this is actual refusal of care. And then more than 1 in 4 trans people said that they had experienced a bias-motivated physical assault in some setting, whether it was in a healthcare setting, in an employment setting, or on the street or elsewhere. So, very severe and pervasive disparities and bias affecting trans people. Within that, we also found that often trans people of color face the most extreme disparities, and this is just one striking example. It's the unemployment rate by racial and ethnic identity of our survey. At the time we collected the data, which was in 2008-09, general U.S. unemployment was about 7%, and you see the overall sample is 14%, but within the sample, it got as high as 28% reported unemployment among Black trans respondents. And those kinds of disparities we saw throughout the other results that I mentioned in the previous slide. One other example of this is we found that that many people said that having identity documents, like a driver's license or a birth certificate, that didn't reflect their gender identity was often a trigger for harassment, discrimination, even physical violence in places of business or government offices where people had to show ID. And so you have here some of the results that we found about that, as well as the differences by racial and ethnic group. I think what this shows is the fact that the lack of congruent identity documents did often turn out to be a trigger for discrimination because of the way in which it outed people and the way in which it drew attention to their transgender status. So I think the next set of slides, I'm handing it back to you, Kyler.
All right, thank you, Harper. We are in slide 15, right?
Yep, 16, yeah.
16, thank you. That's why I went to law school. I didn't learn how to count. So here you'll see a slide of state non-discrimination laws in the United States, and this has filled in tremendously since I have been in this movement, thanks to lots of people working around the country. The plan is nothing new, but to get a groundswell of local protections and county protections, and this has grown tremendously, as you'll see the dates from 1991 when there were hardly any. You see Connecticut, California, to growing to coloring all the jurisdictions, states banning discrimination on sexual orientation and gender identity and expression, which includes 16 and the District of Columbia. States that banned on sexual orientation alone are in the pink, and then I assume that's purple, where they're banning both sexual orientation and gender identity. Obviously, we have a ways to go. And you see the Northeast, and usually there goes the Northeast goes the rest of us, and we're getting the West Coast, and we actually have the progressive states in the middle of the country, and we hope eventually that does work its way down. But we do see progressions in some of these other states in white, where more municipalities on the local level obviously are passing laws. And hopefully that works its way up. But also you can see the need that we need more non-discrimination protections for trans people, because people are, as Harper's already shown you, the drastic numbers of harassment and the low-income trans people make, and regardless of the level of education.
What you don't see on this map is where those local protections are, and increasingly they are in states all over the map, including places like Missouri, Utah,
Missouri,
South Carolina, and so forth, right?
Yes, exactly. Thank you, Harper. So
if you want to get an idea of that, there's a slightly different map at LGBT Map or LGBTmaps.org. I forget which it is, and they actually have a map that's similar to this, but actually shows which states, like how much of the state by population is covered by local laws.
Right, because Harper's right, because I actually am mostly in Missouri, and the protections that have been locally, we've been rolling like crazy. And so thanks for pointing that out, that there's a map. And you can also go to www.TLPI, which is Transgender Law and Policy Institute, which has that map as well. And you can find that map with the local protections for non-discrimination. So thank you, Harper. And so it shows the need, even though these local protections are happening, because in some states, no matter how many local protections we pass, I don't think the State House will. The idea is that so many local protections will happen that then the General Assembly in the state will hopefully pass legislation. But in the meantime, we still have people that need employment drastically, and that's a huge, huge problem. As Harper showed, if we're not employed, then there's so many problems that occur for us, from health care, homelessness, and beyond. Any other comments, Harper, before I move to slide 17?
I don't think so.
All right, so love this. Still no explicit federal protections, and Capitol Hill is on a gridlock, as we all know, regardless of what the issue is now, but particularly these. So in the interim, what do? Slide 18 we move to shows there's been a patchwork of federal legislation, but it's taken, not legislation, case law, court rulings, and we've only highlighted some of the key court cases out there, because most people will assume that Title VII protects. We're not talking about sexual orientation, but they do assume that it will protect sexual orientation. Then it also assumes that it will protect gender identity, but it does not. And I actually am an early litigant personally myself who filed under Title VII protections and was denied protection because courts said, well, the coverage was only meant for men and women, not people that were trans. They only knew transsexual at the time. Then they started to expand to gender identity and expression. But some court cases that were key, City of Salem, Smith versus City of Salem, which you have all the citations there, where there was a firefighter who came out as trans. That's one of the first solid court cases that relies on Title VII, but it goes back to the Price Waterhouse case in 1989, which I actually relied on to make the argument that it's sex stereotyping, and that trans falls under sex under Title VII, so therefore should be protected. We have a whole line of cases ending with Schroyer versus Billington, which was huge, as well as Lopez versus River Oaks, but I think Schroyer because it was in the District of Columbia, where Diane Schroyer applied for a job with the Library of Congress, was hired, and then was denied the job after indicating that she would transition. And the ACLU took on that case, and one of our dear friends, Sharon McGowan, litigated that case and won under Title VII theory. And then Glenn versus Brumby in the 11th Circuit in Georgia in 2011 also affirmed that Title VII could be used as an avenue for protection of trans people. The problem, however, is that all jurisdictions are not bound by the same case law and don't have to adhere to that case law. So then we still have a problem in jurisdictions where there are no solid Title VII court case rulings on that. So then we get to this last year in slide 19, which was also another, even though we've had like not so great things happen, something major happened, which is the EEOC decision on the EEOC's position in the Macy versus Holder case, that the EEOC came out and said that Title VII does apply to people that are transgender. And when an employer discriminates against someone because the person is transgender, the employer has engaged in disparate treatment because of sex, which is protected under Title VII. So that's a clear ruling by the EEOC, but again, problem being is that the EEOC position is only a suggestion to courts. Courts are not bound by bound by the EEOC decision. And you go through that it's covered regardless whether an employer discriminates because the individual has expressed his or her gender in a non-stereotypical fashion, or the employer is uncomfortable with the fact that the person is transitioned or is in the process of transitioning, or because the employer simply does not like that the person is identifying as transgender, which is generally the case because we're afraid of the unknown. And personally, in my case, was the case of because I looked the same, I actually dressed the same. All I did was announce that I was transitioning, and then it was became a huge issue. So implications, slide 20, binding, as I said, on federal agencies and instructive for private employers, which most employers do look to EEOC for guidance, and it's instructive to courts, but again, not binding on courts, which becomes problematic for us. And I think am I handing over to Harper for slide 21 to talk to you about state and model DMV policies.
Right. So beyond specifically non-discrimination laws, the other area in which there is sort of a background legal framework that's important is what we often call gender recognition. That's to say the ways in which people's gender identity are or are not officially recognized by various government systems. And this is often something that employers think that they might want to look to in designing their own systems and policies and procedures. The complication with that, especially in the United States, is the zany and often really problematic for individuals patchwork of different state and local systems and policies with regard to gender recognition. So just to start with the ID that people use most, state IDs and driver's licenses. This map shows the 10 or so states that currently have what we would consider to be the model policy for gender change, for gender recognition. They have a simple one-page form that can be filled out by the person and co-signed for them by, it could be a doctor, but it could also be a therapist, social worker, and it is not really about going to court or proving that you've had certain medical procedures. It's really just about confirming your gender identity. And that model policy exists in those states. At the same time, as you see on the next slide, we also have a large number of states that have extremely restrictive policies for state IDs. And these may include requirements to prove that you've had some particular form of transition-related surgery, which many individuals may not need or may not be able to have, or the requirement to go to court and get a judge's approval, which can also often be not only an expensive and burdensome process, but can be subject to the whims of particular local judges. So those red states are those ones that have those kinds of very restrictive or often arbitrary policies. All the states that are still left in white have something in between, some requirement for some sort of medical documentation. It's often unclear exactly what the procedure is, but they're somewhere in between. At the same time, we have a different patchwork, a different set of laws and policies with regard to gender on birth certificates. So in this next slide, you will see that a lot of states change color. And The states in blue are the states with the most trans-friendly policies that make it clear that you can change gender on the birth certificate. It does not depend upon having any arbitrarily identified form of surgical intervention, but it is based on an attestation by the person's medical provider that they've had whatever treatment is appropriate for them in relation to their transition. Those are the most progressive or the most trans-friendly states. California, Washington, Vermont. There's also pending legislation in D.C. At the same time, the states in red are those that have, again, extremely stringent requirements that are based on proof of surgery and or based on getting the approval of a judge. Actually, I think the states in white mostly you go to a judge and it's up to the local judge. The states in red are based on surgery, and the states that are in the darkest color, which I believe is brown, are the couple of states that will not change gender on a birth certificate for any reason. So if you can imagine, if an employer were to base policies on your gender in the personnel record or for other purposes were to base its procedures on what was going on a person's legal documentation, that would be something that probably wouldn't work for a company that has to operate across the country or across different countries because there is all of this variation, and in many parts of the country there are still policies that are very stringent, that are impossible to meet for many trans people, and that are just really inconsistent and maybe even inconsistent with different documents in the same state. Gender recognition when it comes to marriage can be even, again, a different thing. It doesn't always follow those documents. So the U.S. government, as an employer, has guidance that says if you are already married in a marriage that the federal government recognizes and you transition, your benefit situation with your spouse does not change. You are still in a valid marriage, even though you may now appear to be in a same-sex marriage. We take the view that the law does not undo marriages that were validly entered into absent death or divorce. And therefore, that's their approach for those situations. At the same time, the U.S. doesn't have, as an employer, benefits guidance for the other situation where somebody marries after they transition and what gender they're treated of as for purposes of that. However, U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services does have guidance on this, and they say you should look to state-issued documents, especially birth certificates, with regard to that. And most states do have a policy. As I said before, it's often very restrictive. It may be based on surgery, but the federal government will typically look to those state-issued documents and if for purposes of what somebody's gender is for a subsequent marriage. They will look at the state-issued documents, and they will look at what the state law about the ability to marry in that state says. At the state level, in terms of how states actually interpret it, we've actually had quite a variety of things. Most states don't have case law on this issue. The most recent case is from the most recent reported case is from Minnesota, which said essentially the same thing as the feds say, that they would look to the birth certificate, and if it's been updated, then you would go on that for purposes of a subsequent marriage. But you've had a handful of courts around the country, such as the Canteris case in Florida, saying that for purposes of our state's law, gender never, ever, ever changes legally for purposes of marriage. So again, you have something of an inconsistent patchwork of laws and policies. And then what gender someone is treated as can be different again when it comes to sex-segregated institutional settings, such as dormitories, group homes, shelters, jails. This is a little bit beyond our scope here talking about the workplace, but I just wanted to highlight just how varied the way that what gender people are treated as can be. Increasingly in these sex-segregated settings, non-discrimination laws are coming into play, with regulators and courts saying that people have to be treated on the basis of their gender identity, not the gender they were assigned at birth, because to do otherwise would be a violation of state and local discrimination laws. Also in some settings such as jails, taking into account somebody's gender identity is being more and more required under laws and policies concerned with abuse prevention. So that's just to give you a context of how this plays out in different settings. Finally, in terms of workplace experiences, in terms of what people's actual workplace experiences are, I'm going to go back to the NTDS here and say what we actually found about people's experiences in the workplace. Of all our respondents, people who transitioned, people who didn't, 38% said that they told their work colleagues that they were trans or gender nonconforming. Of those who had transitioned, about half said that most or all of their coworkers knew they were trans, and a little over a fourth said only some or a few of their coworkers knew they were trans. And again, among those who had transitioned, a very large majority said that they felt more comfortable at work and their performance improved at work as a result of their transition. So that's a positive reported outcome. On the other hand, we saw a lot of negative reported outcomes, which I think our slide order got mixed up a little bit. So I am going to take the liberty of going forward and then back to address that, if it's all right with you, Kyler.
Sure.
At the same time, we also found that trans people reported a lot of negative outcomes, including harassment, being fired, denied a promotion, denied access to restrooms that were consistent with their gender identity, having their confidentiality about their transgender status or their medical history breached, being harassed in the form of intentional repeated misuse of their personal pronouns or use of their old name. A large number of people said that they hid their trans status or their gender transition, or that they put off transitioning for a long period of time because of the effect that they believed that it would have on their employment situation. This is, again, a graph showing the racial and ethnic disparities we found in these negative outcomes, and again showing that here, Black, Latino, Latina, and multiracial and Native American respondents reported the highest levels of loss of jobs related to coming out or transitioning. We found similar disparities with respect to reports of physical assaults motivated by gender identity in the workplace. So 7% of people overall reported that they had faced a gender-motivated physical violence in the workplace, but we found disparities in how that broke down by racial and ethnic identity. So that's some of the context of sort of existing laws and policies in terms of non-discrimination, gender recognition, and the findings that from the NTDS about people's workplace experiences. And I'm going to hand it over to Kyler and move us back a few slides to talk about workplace policies.
All right. Which slide are we on?
We are on slide 27 about insurance.
All right, thought so. Just wanted to check. So we are back on discrimination and insurance. And Private Care Act, being transgender was a pre-existing condition, and now not considered a pre-existing condition, and that there are many plans that still exclude any related services, or even if trans people go in for an appendectomy, they're still denied because they're trans. And so we're hoping that does change. The Medical Association does, American Medical Association does oppose exclusions. And then model policy, or California, DC, and Oregon say exclusions violate gender or identity non-discrimination laws, which are what we're hoping more for, and we're hoping for more change as we move forward with the arc of time.
I should add, I believe Colorado also issued a similar bulletin just very recently.
Yeah, you're right. In the last few weeks, has it not been?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. All right. Thank you for that. So which is really good. That says that, and we hope more states do get on board saying that this violates non-discrimination laws. So there's certainly no reason, and it's cost-effective for employers to provide insurance. It's not any more cost than regular, and that's what we find out. And there's actually a survey that validates that at www.hrc.org, and I'm not sure on which page that survey is on, but it was done by Jamison Green, and it's helpful to explain to carriers that the coverage doesn't cost any more because people are trans. Impacts of exclusions on slide 28. It affects the health of employees. If they cannot get care and their families cannot get care, then obviously the employee's health suffers greatly. Also, the productivity is not there from the employee because they're focused on health care. Recruitment and retention, if you don't offer the benefits, you're not going to get the best employees to do the job. And then long-term cost savings. That is that if you don't provide coverage, then people will sue, or there are other problems that occur in the workplace. Legal compliance issues as well, and then it's just equity. And other employees see that if someone else is not being treated well, pretty soon they get the idea that they're not going to be treated well either, and therefore they then decide that maybe they don't want to work there, but it impacts everybody's morale, not just the trans person either. So I think Brianna has a question. We could take that during Q&A. Oh, no, that's not a question. It's from Roberto again. On slide 29, there is a short poll because I know we're running out of time. And if everybody would take that poll to indicate if your company does provide policies that include gender identity expression protections, that would be great. The options are yes, no, currently considering, or you're unsure. So if you would take that poll, we would greatly appreciate it to see. Oh, it's great. 2 say yes. I know Brianna had to step away. And then 1 is unsure, and 1 is currently under consideration. So super, super. So, and just to the essence of time, Roberto, I'm going to go ahead and move to slide 30 and get through the slides. So we get, you did that already. We did 31. We did 32. We're to 33. And what I want to quote is that I was honored to be there. We had the Employment Non-Discrimination Act hasn't been mentioned here, and of course we're advocating for that to be inclusive of sexual orientation and gender identity, which would provide federal protection for discrimination in employment. We had Senate hearings in 2008, which I'm sorry, not the Senate, but the House hearings in 2008, where testimony was received in support of inclusivity of trans people. And then in 2012, we had the Senate finally, and we were happy to have the Senate hear testimony. And I just wanted to share with you, and there are many statements by diversity and inclusion vice presidents out there, but Kenneth Charles, who testified at that hearing, who simply just said this: our business case for diversity and inclusion is a simple equation. Diversity plus inclusion equals business value. When you combine diversity, which we define simply as difference, with a culture that acknowledges, respects, and values all of our differences and similarities, good things happen. We find ourselves able to connect with our consumers, customers, and communities. we new ideas and innovation, and we recruit and retain the talent to win now and in the future. And General Mills has been doing this for years and has found no problems with it, and found, again, that the productivity has gone out of the roof. So that's really amazing, and that we hear more and more major corporations indicate this. And I know there are tons of Fortune 500, and if you go to the next slide, 34, 50% have gender identity in the EEO policies, and hopefully more and more are working to do that. 19% have inclusive health benefits. We don't quite know who have transition guidelines or not, and I was going to mention the Human Rights Campaign Corporate Equality Index has required as of, and I can't remember, Harper, if you want to help me out, if it's been 2 years or 3 years ago, that they added that gender identity health benefits, I think it may have be only 2, if not 1, be part of that index for employers to score 100% on the Corporate Equality Index. So 33% of the 636 companies in that index apparently have complied with that, and more want to, because they want that 100% coverage. Finally, our last slide, 35, state and federal guidance was mentioned earlier. The U.S. Office of Personnel Management, guidance to federal employers, and covers transition plans and equal access issues, and Harper had mentioned that earlier. State regulations also in Colorado and D.C. are very helpful to look at. State local guidelines are listed there. EEOC, we hope, are going to have guidelines forthcoming for employers, and that will be helpful for employers to follow. And with that, I think that leaves us with about 10 minutes queue for questions and answers.
All right. Thanks so much, Kyler and Harper. What I want to do is go ahead and move us over to some question and answer. Roberto actually had excuse me, a question, and Roberto's question was, can a transsexual who's undergoing transition be fired during their transition?
Yes. Sorry to answer so quickly.
Go ahead.
I take it that actually, Kyler. I mean, I think if I understand the thrust of the question correctly, there are some countries where under the workplace laws, you actually can't terminate somebody while they're pregnant. The idea being that that's a preventive measure to prevent employers from terminating somebody with the motivation of avoiding additional healthcare utilization, or based on the assumption that there will be other negative impacts on the employer or on the workplace performance.
But the question that was just asked, though, was, can somebody be fired for transitioning?
There's nothing parallel to that in U.S. law, either for pregnancy or for trans folks. What you would have to do is establish. I mean, there's no law that says you can't fire someone when they're transitioning. But the way the law is developing is that you can't fire someone because they're transitioning. So the fact that someone is transitioning does not protect them from being laid off. However, under gender identity, state and local laws, as well as the emerging view of sex discrimination under federal law, if the reason that the employer is terminating somebody is because of assumptions related to the gender transition, because of bias related to that, or because of some anticipated increased medical utilization, that all of those, if proven, would constitute prohibited discrimination. Does that answer your question?
Roberto's muted, so.
Yeah, and thank you, Harper, for jumping in. But yeah, I was just answering cues with the initial question of, yes, people can be, and obviously there are protections out there that, in certain jurisdictions that would protect them, as Harper just pointed out before I wasn't able to finish that comment. So.
Okay. And a question I was thinking of: Can you move from a state that move to a state that does allow document change without surgeries or things like that, if you presently live in some place that doesn't allow it, and have your documents changed?
Yes and no. You're stuck with the state you were born in generally for purposes of your birth certificate. However, and if you were born in a different state, sometimes it's difficult to get a court order either for purposes of changing the certificate from the state you were born in or for other purposes of having some kind of official recognition of your gender identity. It can be difficult to bring an action in court like that in a state that you were not born in, even if you live there now. With regard to state IDs and driver's licenses, perhaps obviously, it's relatively easy to get ID according to the policy of the state that you live in, but often people are stuck with the law or the policy that exists for birth certificates in the place where they were born. And even if they are eligible to change it under the rules of the place where they were born, there can be significant obstacles relating to having to go to court when you live across the country from where you were born.
Well, and I would like to say, because I have had to represent people, and if you're denied access in one jurisdiction, you're allowed equity in another, and I've actually had attorneys that are trans people fly to me to get their gender changed, and we make the argument and brief it to the court that they're denied access, and no one, and we make that argument, and then the court actually here or in whatever state they're in, wherever I am, and waive in, then allows us access to do the change there. But then a practical problem may occur as to whether the records people in your state will then, although they should, due to full faith and credit, accept the out-of-state jurisdiction to change the documents, but some have policies or choose not to enforce that out-of-state order, even if they do have an out-of-state order. But you can get equity jurisdiction in other jurisdictions.
Short answer, it's way more complicated, variable, and often difficult in the U.S. than it is in a growing number of other countries.
Yeah, and I agree with that.
All right, thank you. Roberto had another part to his question, was asking basically what he wanted to know was if a person is fired during their transition, what happens in their transition process? Say that their job has been covering some of that, will they be able to complete that process, or will that be something that they'll just have to halt in midstream because they no longer have that?
And since Harper, would you mind if I answer this since you've since the other ones? And I think this is simple. That yeah, it does. I mean, if you're terminated and your coverage is with the company, then it might be halted. But you could also use your COBRA to extend it for the 18 months. But yeah, you're basically out of luck, having been one of those people that was terminated during transition, but kept my COBRA coverage. Now, if she has been taking hormones during the last year, already done some surgical, will the job be left incomplete? Well, it will be left where it is again unless the COBRA coverage is still in effect.
And from a broader social perspective, this underscores the problem that we have of a growing number of large employers eliminating exclusions in their coverage, but you know, that makes people very tied to their job, even though they may be able to get another job or access coverage in another way, because the extent to which these discriminatory exclusions in insurance still exist is so widespread and uneven. It really can impact people when they leave a particular job. That even if when they get covered again, the scope of their coverage may be dramatically diminished or changed.
Thanks so much. So we're running up on the very edge of our time. A footnote for everyone else who may not have heard when we do introductions. Roberto is actually in Spain, so I appreciate that Roberto is on the call because he helps us think of these things in a more global perspective. So he has a lot of information or things that are done differently in Spain, so I always appreciate his input. But,
and I apologize for the U.S.-centric nature of our presentation, which is even clearer to me having been abroad last week.
All right.
Well,
Go ahead.
Roberto, thank you for being on the call, and thank you for offering your perspective, because we certainly all need to work together to figure this out. So it's been great to have you on the call and your questions.
All right, so Harper and Kyler, I'd like to give you a moment to give closing comments for today.
Harper, you'd like to go?
I would like to thank you all for joining us. I hope that we have given you a useful foundation for the different sort of things that come into play when you're thinking about gender identity in the workplace and what best practices might look like and things like that are going to go into in more depth in the subsequent sessions. But I hope it's been informative and thought-provoking and creates that foundation to go a little deeper in the next couple of times in the next few weeks.
All right, and I join Harper in that sentiment, and hopefully we've laid a good foundation for the next courses. And I thank you. I think you've been a great group to work with, and I appreciate your time.